In the last video, we talked about how to make a thread in a piece of material using a tap. Remember, we put the tap in a tap handle, we drilled a certain size hole, and then we made a thread. If we did it right, then everything should go in properly. There should be a 90-degree, and presto, then we have a thread. This is another example I think I did in the last video, if you remember. And if it's done right, that should literally just spin on there nice and easily. I think I used the example or the analogy from health class or sex ed, the idea of a female thread and a male thread. You know that that sort of idea. It's very common in industry and out there, if you work in the trades and stuff, to talk about a male and a female thread. So just as a review, when you're making a female thread, you need to drill a certain size hole that's smaller than the thread that you want. You make it smaller so that when the tap goes in, it cuts that thread, and you've seen that thread in there. That thread is that little spiral in there. I don't know if the camera is going to be able to zoom in, but you need to make the hole smaller than you want. So when you cut the thread, it opens up the hole a little bit, just makes it a little bit bigger than the thread that you were planning to, for the thread that you're making. And that was that whole premise of that chart. I said it before in the video, and I highlighted it in a blue square. Let's see if I can zoom in here properly. You remember when we were looking at different sizes, you have a fine thread or a coarse thread. And that one over in the red, that's the drill, the tap drill size. If you want to do a 1/2 inch 13 course, you have to drill 27/64. That's the size. It's smaller than a 1/2 inch, but it gets you the size that you want. In this video, I want to talk about the opposite. We've been making female threads with the tap. What if you want to make a male thread? For example, let's say I have this bolt. There is a thread put on here, because if you look carefully, there is a certain piece of round shaft, just a round piece of metal, and somehow they put the thread on there. You can go to Home Depot and you can buy a piece of threaded rod. It's already round shaft, and someone has threaded the whole thing one long length. Some bolts you get, I can show them, some bolts have the thread all the way along, and some of them only have a portion. I'm not going to go into the reasons. There's different styles of bolts and different reasons that you would do that. What I want to show is, how do you do it? Unfortunately, I haven't stuff at home that's easy to do a demo, but I did bring some of the things that you can use, and I'm going to show that in this set. But here's the idea. If I want to make, I'm going to use the 1/2 inch bolt. If I have a 1/2 inch bolt and I measure the diameter, as I said in the last video, it comes in just under a 1/2 inch. So I know that diameter is a 1/2 inch. Remember, it's a little bit smaller just so it goes into the hole. If it was exactly a 1/2 inch diameter, it wouldn't go in very easily into the thread. So we have a 1/2 inch bolt. I just happen to know it's a coarse thread. I had looked up already and I had found the taps for that. This is the 1/2 inch coarse tap, and this is the 1/2 inch fine, and you can see how the threads are closer together on the fine tap than on the coarse tap. This is the most common. Virtually most bolts you ever get are coarse thread. The fine ones are the more rare. So I know that that's a 1/2 inch coarse threaded bolt. If I wanted to make a 1/2 inch coarse threaded bolt, I wouldn't use a tap, because that's for making the female thread. I actually have to use one of these things. This is called a die. And if I can show it, it's really like the reverse of a tap. If you look inside, you'll see these little sharp cutter tools. And this piece, this die, can go over a round shaft and make a bolt or make a thread. So I just had my piece here. I don't know what I did with it. If I had a round shaft and I wanted to put a thread on it, here it is, sorry. How would I put a thread on this shaft? Well, here's how it's done. If I measure this diameter, if I want to make, say, a 1/2 inch thread, I need to find a round shaft that has a diameter of a 1/2 inch. So I would set this at 1/2 inch, and 1/2 inch, and then I would find that, now this one's too small because that's all I had, but I'm showing the example. If I had a 1/2 inch shaft, smooth like this, I could put it into my vise, and then instead of a tap, I would use what's called a die. And here, I don't know if the video is going to show this, but it does show a 1/2 inch 13. I think you can kind of see it, 1/2 inch 13. And this is how you would cut a thread on a 1/2 inch shaft. Now it would go in like this. Obviously this shaft's too small, but you would put it in much like cutting a thread on with a tap, and you would turn this, and it would slowly spiral down and cut the thread. Unfortunately, again at home I don't have any 1/2 inch shaft, and my other taps or my other dies don't work. So I'm going to pretend. Let's pretend this is the 1/2 inch bolt. Let me move the camera a little bit. Let's pretend there's no thread there. Then I would put this on here, and then I would push down and try to make it square, and I would turn, go back and break the chips, just like with a tap. The die and a tap are really just the male and female of the same idea. And I would just go down, and I would slowly spiral down, cutting the thread as I go. And as I cut down, the thread would appear. And then I would just take the die off, and magic, magic, there would be a thread there. I had this set given to me, and I tried to use it before the video to practice, and then I broke it because it's really just a cheap Canadian Tire one. But you have all of these different dies. Each one has a certain size on it. So in this case, it's a number 832 national course. So you can see it's actually quite a small thread in there. But this would go into here, and then this screw would stop it from spinning in the handle. And what I did was I tried to cut a thread, and then it broke the handle. It's so cheap aluminum, but you get the idea. All of these dies are available in all the standard sizes. Surprisingly, I've never seen one of these, a 7/16 National Fine. So this would make a fine 7/16 thread, which is a very rare thread. I don't know if I've ever seen one of those. But there's all the different sizes available. You have to have some kind of a shaft that matches the diameter of your bolt. So if you had a 5/16 thread, this diameter on my fingers, this diameter right here has to be 5/16, because when the die cuts, it actually makes the thread a bit smaller, if you can picture that. If you had a 1/2 inch thread on a shaft, you need a 1/2 inch diameter, and then the die actually makes the thread a bit smaller. That's kind of the opposite logic of when we did taps. Remember, when we tapped a female thread, we actually started with the hole smaller, and when we tapped, it got bigger. When you're making a male thread using a die, you start with the shaft diameter you want, and you actually thread it, and it starts to get a bit smaller. Basically, it gets smaller inside those little grooves where my fingernail is. That's where it's getting smaller. But the outside diameter stays the same. So on the assignment sheet that I gave in class, there are some questions talking about making a male thread, or making a thread, say, on a shaft for an axle where you might put a wheel on your bicycle and put a nut on it, or for some reason you want a thread on some kind of an axle or a shaft. And the classic question is, what diameter shaft do I need? If I need a 3/4 inch threaded shaft, I need a 3/4 diameter basic shaft rod here to make the thread. If I want a 1/4 inch thread, I need a 1/4 inch shaft. So it's kind of the opposite logic to making the female thread, where you actually drill the hole smaller so that you open the hole up to that size. The shaft, or making the male thread, you start with the size you want and then you thread it, and it just gets a bit smaller on the inside part. Okay, so that's it. I will leave you to work on your assignment sheet. There's a few more questions about making male threads using a die system. I'm sorry again that I couldn't come with a better example. I just don't have any shaft in my house that's the right diameter to match the dies that I have. But I think you can get the idea. Okay, good luck.